Just let us know if you want us to start singing the Jeopardy theme.
All righty. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming this evening. My name is Christy Thomas, and I'm a reference librarian at the Oakland Main Library. I hope you have found books to be a comfort during these challenging times like I have. And it's always a pleasure to be in the library or on Zoom to celebrate books and their creators. I'd like to give a special thank you to our partner bookseller this evening, Walden Pond Books. And I have the honor of introducing two fantastic authors this evening. Matthew Clark Davison is the author of the debut novel, Doubting Thomas, published by Amble Press, which has been championed by Michael Cunningham, Ann Packer, T. Kira Madden, Armistead Maupin, and others. He is creator and teacher of the lab, writing classes with MCD, a non-academic school started in 2007 in a friend's living room in San Francisco. The textbook version of the lab, co-authored by best-selling writer Alice LaPlante, will be published by Norton in 2022. His prose has appeared in a variety of literary magazines, including The Atlantic Monthly, Guernica, and LitHub. He works full-time as faculty in the creative writing department at San Francisco State University. Zoella Renee Summerfield, fellow novelist and author of Every Other Weekend, had this to say about Matthew's debut novel. In all my years of reading, I've never quite encountered a book like Doubting Thomas. What is seemingly a book about scandal and betrayal becomes, in Davison's skilled hands, a prismatic view of one man's grappling with the complexities of family, community, history, memory, and self. Doubting Thomas is nuanced, layered, detailed, and incredibly touching. In short, this is a fiercely complicated story, beautifully told. I'm also so pleased to welcome Andrew Demčák, the author of 6 poetry collections and 8 young adult novels. His books have been featured by the American Library Association, Verse Daily, the Lambda Literary Foundation, The Best American Poetry, Kirkus Reviews, and Poets and Writers. Andrew is the recipient of the 3 Candles Press Open Book Award and has been a finalist for numerous others. He has an MFA in English and Creative Writing from St. Mary's College and is a member of the Squaw Valley Community of Writers. The poet Joan Larkin, who selected Andrew's book, Catching Tigers in Red Weather, for the 3 Candles Press Award, had this to say about his work. Andrew Demčák's poems make acrobatic leaps and turns, flashing their urban wit, their old young wisdom, and their exhilarating language and feeling. Demčák's ingenious invention is a compact, elegant form, repeated throughout the book as world after surprising world, under intense pressure, flares within it. This is a book of gems. Thank you so much for being here, Matthew Clark Davison and Andrew Demčák.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful. I am also a librarian at Oakland Public Library, so I work with Christy, which is pretty neat. Because I'm the collection development librarian, I'm in charge of basically all the different kinds of books that we purchase for the library. It's really, really exciting to have read Matthew's Doubting Thomas and be able to talk to him about it. I find it fascinating talking to other writers. I learned so much just from seeing their work, reading their work, interacting with them, finding out what their process is. And I'm sure we may have some aspiring writers in the audience as well. One of the first things that I always like to sort of get out of the way as a reader, I just wanted to ask you, Matthew, so your lead character, Thomas, about what percentage of him would you say is actually you?
Well, in some ways, 100%, in some ways, 0%. So I would probably average it out at around 50. Thomas, like me, is one of three boys, like the gay boy out of three boys. His brothers are both straight. His family moved from California to Massachusetts in 1980 or somewhere about there, as Thomas does in my book. And other things like that I really borrowed. My younger brother, Paul, in real life, was diagnosed with fatal cancer like Jake was in the book, but luckily my brother was misdiagnosed, and like Jake, he survived cancer. And but believe it or not, I actually made up that the brother character Jake had cancer prior to my younger brother actually having a very similar kind of cancer, which was weird. So things like that, I mean, definitely echo my own real life. But my older brother John said, "You wrote a book about a guy that passes as straight?" I was like, "Yeah." And then he said, "You wrote a book about a guy that passes as straight?" And Thomas left San Francisco during the height of the AIDS pandemic, and I was right here in the center of it. Thomas was, sort of in his own ways, like avoided a deep entrenchment in the gay community, and I was on the corner of homo and sexual at all times. So in many ways, we're very different. And also, to a fault, I'm reactionary and emotionally reactive, whereas Thomas is very deliberate and slow to react. And in some cases, like I really was playing with like trying to see how long I could get him to do nothing after this accusation that happens at the very beginning of the novel. How about you? How about you with the book of yours that I read is Ghost Songs, and so Todd in that book, what's the percentage of Andrew?
Well, certainly, I mean, that character is very close to my heart, and is that whole book is very much a roman à clef. It is a novel with a key, and if you know people in my family, and if you know where I went to school, and my friends, you can pretty much pick them out in the novel. I too was I was a flute player, and most of the stuff that I wrote about in the that had to do with the orchestra, those things really happened. We did not have an oboe for some reason. We didn't have an oboe, and so when I was actually the concert master at first chair flute, everybody tuned to me because apparently flutes have the second most perfect A to tune to. The oboe has the most perfect A. So anyway, that's just stuff. But yeah, definitely. But I think that Todd is a little bit tougher than I was. Definitely, I was bullied the same way that he was, and I wanted to talk about that. But I never really fought back in the way that Todd sort of does at one point. I never really did that. I'm not a violent person, and but at the same time, it felt really good to write about a kid that was basically a gay kid who's being bullied for that, and him actually fighting back and like throwing a punch that lands and really does some damage. That was very cathartic for me, and it was so interesting writing it because one of the questions that you're up on Goodreads, and sometimes people will ask you questions as an author, and one of the things they asked was, why do I like being a novelist? And I said, it's the only way I can experience time travel. And it's absolutely true, because when I was writing about being in like 8th grade back in 1982, literally I was back in that moment, and there were members only jackets and Rubik's cubes, and all of those things were there and informing like the things that I wanted to talk about, being this kid in this time period. And also the thing that I really wanted to do, especially placing it in the 80s, is that when I was reading books in the 80s, I never read about gay characters. Gay teenagers were absent from everything. And so I just wanted to make sure that people realized that we were there too. We've always been there. And so this, this is my statement to like the 80s horror novels, is that, hey, a queer kid was there too, and, experienced things and lived through that and had this traumatic stuff happen and grew from it, and became closer with his friend because of it. And and also I wanted to write a book where his gayness was not the main thing about the book. It wasn't an after school special. It was just something that was there and was a problem sometimes for him, but he had other problems.
Yeah, he really did. I appreciate that. Also, I was thinking about how like there was this, one of the ways that as a little gay boy that was, when I was born in 1970, the places where I found queerness were really unlikely. Like, for example, like there was a soap opera, I can't remember what it was called, but it was the one that was set in the fashion industry. And there was no gay characters. But by then I had already, was really, I followed, by the time 1982 or so came around, I somehow found out about Jean-Paul Gaultier and what's his name, the other super gay guy with the giant fan and the big black sunglasses. Who am I talking about?
Karl Lagerfeld.
Karl Lagerfeld, et cetera. And so I knew that these characters existed. And also there was the guy in the center square. But like in all of the places where you would expect to see gay people, there weren't. But there was a certain way in which, like, I would read Judy Blume as a kid, and I just felt like the fact that there was sex, that young people were thinking about sex and sexuality in a way was maybe something. And then also horror was, I wasn't a big reader when I was a kid, but once in a while when I did read, I would pick up a Stephen King novel, and I just remember thinking that there was something kind of queer about it.
Absolutely. And it's weird being drawn to queer stuff to the monstrous as a queer person, because there was a book that I read that was all about queerness and monstrousness, and how you can go back through like the old James Whale films like Bride of Frankenstein and find a lot of like little symbols and things that queer people would recognize, like, oh yeah, I know what that is. I know what this is. This is, nobody else is getting this in the audience, but I'm getting it. And I think that's fascinating. I mean, I was the same way. I was not a big reader when I was younger. And, but, I remember like when the Amityville Horror came out and I had to read that book. And I remember that on the chapters, the number of flies that were on the chapter heading meant the scarier it was, the more number of flies there were.
Oh, yeah. Oh my God.
Printed on the actual pages. And I just remember like, I couldn't sleep for 6 days or something after I read that. I was so terrified.
I wonder about that. Like, I wonder if for us then it was about having, like, because day-to-day life could be so scary for stuff that you couldn't help. If somehow externalizing it, I mean, I'm not a good psychoanalyst, but I wonder if like part of my strategy was that I was looking for things that were genuinely like horrifying in order to help make sense of the sort of low-key terror that I was experiencing 24/7.
Absolutely. I think you're really onto something. And one of the things about ghost songs I wanted to do too was write a ghost story where the ghost was not the scariest thing. Like the supernatural element was not the scariest thing, that the things that were the people were the scariest, were the scary part of the book. And, it's just kind of interesting trying to play against genres like that. Like, so much like queer YA is all about coming out, and, and there's a little bit of coming out that happens in ghost songs. It happens on an ice skating rink revolving around a discussion of David Bowie. But, that's exactly how it would have come naturally. And I tried to make it seem as natural as possible. And when I first wanted to write this book about some of the experiences that my friends had, and I had witnessed these different kinds of like sort of traumatic experiences, at first I thought I'm just going to write a straight up realistic novel, but it was so heavy. And I thought, I've got to do something to lighten this, because it's just, no one's going to want to read this. My target audience is not going to want to read this. And so I just kind of figured, well, you know, I was totally obsessed with ghosts, and I read every book about ghosts and Bigfoot and UFOs, you know, that were written back then. And so I thought that was probably a good way of kind of like making it less heavy. Because that's been one of the main criticisms of the book is, why do you have the ghost in there? And I'm like, because if it don't have the ghost, it's like, that's like sort of like this counterpoint to the really, really heavy, you know, abuse and alcoholism and people taking advantage of, adults taking advantage of kids, you know, because kids are so trusting. And that's scary. You know, that to me is what's really scary. You know, but yeah, I think that's really interesting. Yeah, because it is tough when you're a queer kid and you're trying to find your way. And, you know, and you end up doing the things like Thomas does. I mean, you try to blend in, you try to, you know, be the best little whatever in the world, so that you can fit in with your group or with the people who are like in charge of things. You know, and that's tough, and that gets old. And that's why I think we all root for Thomas towards the second half of the book, when he starts finding himself and realizing, you know, what a token he's been. And I thought that was so brilliant. I can't remember reading a book that so eloquently and so naturally addressed all these different social topics, and, you know, different historical things, different things about race and age and queerness, and but did it in this multi-generational way that made perfect sense. And there was no soapboxes anywhere in there with characters, you know, saying something that just doesn't seem right, seems phony, seems like, you know, just like the author trying to say something. None of that happens in your book. It's so natural. It's such a gift. It's such a gift for our community to have this book. I mean, I think it's fantastic because, again, it goes against the genre. I mean, people are expecting a revenge novel. You know, they're expecting like, oh yeah, he's really going to stick it to them. And what happens is that he kind of like sticks it to himself and then grows from that. You know, he abandons all his security. He abandons all of that and ends up out on this, you know, high wire, taking care of a child at the end of the book, which is fantastic. I mean, I was just so blown away.
Thanks. Thank you. I mean, that's a lot to take in, and I appreciate it so much. I'm gonna try to really hear that. You know what you can do if you're afraid of being on a soapbox, just put a lawyer in your book. Jerome, the lawyer, my book. It's like I actually, a lot of Jerome's dialogue. Jerome always existed in the book. From there was a lawyer from even when it was a short story, like day one. As the title existed from day one, almost everything else changed from day one to like 8 years later. But or however many years later, it was probably even more than that. But Thomas was thinking and saying a lot of the things that, because he was more like me, he was like angry and reactive. And then I realized, wait a minute, I actually have I have a friend in my real life who is a lawyer, and 100% of his cases are about discrimination in the LGBTQ community. It's most frequently trans folks, and it's most frequently around their transitions at work and what can sometimes go down. And then also it's most frequently work related. So it's really different than what Jerome does in the book, but it's literally his job to point out hypocrisy and to show, to expose the things that the people that are, taking away something from Thomas that he's found innocent. And so, I just wanted to say to anybody here that might be an aspiring fiction writer that if you do want to get up on a soapbox, just put a lawyer character in.
I remember too, I had this one playwriting class, and they said, if you want to create a scene where almost anybody could show up. So it doesn't seem strange that here's a, a circus juggler, and then also like this heiress, is either put it in an airport waiting lounge or put it in some place where some transportation hub where these people can be coming in and they can be
or the DMV or an AA meeting.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
These are tricks of the trade. So don't judge us too harshly if you read our books and realize that some of the edges are showing. But fiction is fiction, and this is something that I had a really hard time with when I first started writing fiction. Was I wanted to write what I knew, and and that's not your real day-to-day life, or your day-to-day story isn't necessarily that interesting. And I had an early beta reader tell me, I have this other book that's called If There's a Heaven Above, about my days in the sort of death rock music scene in Los Angeles in the late 80s. And I have this scene where the lead character and his love interest are about to have sex, and then they decide not to because this was at the height of the AIDS epidemic, and they don't have a condom and they don't want to do anything. And my beta reader is like, well, what would happen if they did have sex? And I was like, whoa, suddenly like, oh my God. And this whole part of the book was born at that moment. And then it was all about like remembering when I went and had an HIV test back then, and I had to wait for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of hell, you know what I mean?
I wrote a story called The Result, and I was shocked that the Atlantic took it, because it was all about that moment after the 2 weeks that you've waited, where the person slides the results across the table with your matching sticker.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's horrible. I mean, and it's
terrifying.
Yeah, it is so terrifying. And I mean, I know, and people get test results back all the time, but that in particular was just such an awful time, and we had, I mean, it was so strange thinking about like one of the questions that I was going to get to in a little bit too was just asking about like queer heroes and literary heroes and stuff like that. And we're kind of from the generation that had our mentors wiped out. Like we had this whole generation of queer people who were, 10, 20 years older than us just disappear. It's like they never existed. They just evaporated, and it's so hard to kind of find your way when you don't have anything to model. You don't have you can't model your relationship. There's no what relationships? I can't, everyone's gone, or it's so strange to try to find your way when there's nobody, creating the trail for you. And it's so interesting, like psychologically, like we're that generation, and sex will always be really weird for me because, I just remember what it was like, being so afraid of sex, wanting to have sex so desperately, being 18, 19, full of hormones and but then also terrified, and I remember doing things like saying, I would not take my underwear off. I'll go in the bed with you, but this is not coming off, and it makes you like this weird, like Victorian or something, suddenly, and in this land of libertines. And I don't know, it was
such a time.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I wanted to say something about something that you said earlier about, about the ghost in the book. And also just like deciding what you're going to do if people like projecting onto, I love heavy, I love dark. And so I also did as a young person. I'm a joyful person in real life. People that know me in real life often think that I'm funny. And then they read my novel and they're like, or they read my work and they're like, oh my, like, what is this? So in Doubting Thomas, I put recipes in. Like, you might think that this is because it's a really bad year in the life of a guy. This guy, like this accusation is like one of many things that he's dealing with. And but I think that having been at the center of the HIV and AIDS crisis, I am completely fascinated by, obsessed with, and have experienced many different forms since, when relentlessness happens. And COVID is another time where it's just it's like, oh, okay, well, I remember Alice LaPlante, my co-writer of the novel that Christy mentioned. And Christy, thank you so much for both for hosting us here and for the work that you do at the library. Tied for first place, my favorite people on earth with nurses or librarians, because my mom's a nurse. I love librarians. I love grouchy librarians. I love the whole cast of librarians and ghost songs. There's quite a few librarians and ghost songs. I love
Yes,
librarians.
there are.
Christy, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and for hosting us today. What I was going to say is that that the way that Leroy just sort of appears, and like you were saying that you didn't want it to be a big coming out story and his gayness to be sort of matter of fact. I love how like everything supernatural in the book was sort of matter of fact. And Edie's questioning of like the sort of occult within the book, those kinds of aspects of it, was, in line with her personality in the same way that she was, questioning the fancy grocery store they end up going to. She's just like, you know what I mean? She had her one eyebrow up.
Absolutely.
Until she had her transformation, her transformation. But I do think that it's that the idea of like what to dramatize and what not to, and how to sort of deal with how it is that people might be, what they might expect from like a bully or a victim of bullying or whatever, and then how to subvert that is also a very queer thing. It's like and seeing something very erotic and something that may not be to the average person, and seeing something boring or mundane and something that's generally asserted as super exciting. I think that these are all ways in which I think a kind of a queer sensibility starts to make it to the page. And also when you were talking about that novel and talking about what you were surviving, I just wondered too, because I know that you cross genre. I was wondering if we might both want to read a little bit, because I think the topic of today is like queering words. And I think we're already talking about it, but the subtitle is working across genre. And when you said in fiction, but to me, your poems have many of the same obsessions as that I found in ghost songs, but they are rendered in a very different way. And so I wondered whether or not you might want to read a couple of poems and maybe a short piece from ghost songs.
Sure. And it's interesting because I was going to ask you, May Sarton, the lesbian novelist, although she would reject that term lesbian, but anyway, she said at one point that she wrote poetry to know what she felt, and she wrote novels to know what happened. And I always thought that was really interesting, because I'm kind of what you would call a language poet because of the actual mechanical nature of how I write stuff, because I do cut up. And so, which is also another kind of queer thing, because it was, the Surrealists did it, but William S. Burroughs is the one, and Brian Gysin, who really turned me onto it when I started reading the novels that William S. Burroughs wrote in that method. And so I started writing poetry that way, because it was an interesting way of like, at the time when I started writing poetry, confessional poetry was just the thing. It was the thing. Everybody was talking about, something really, really emotional, something really sensitive. And after a while, when you're just exposed to it, it just starts, there's this sameness that starts happening, and it stops like sort of having its power. And I found ways to basically take texts and chop them into pieces and rearrange the words and let the words kind of inspire me to write a line, where I could start creating something that would either be a story that I knew, be one of my stories, and I could start sort of informing it that way, or it would be something that's more kind of fiction, and I could see the story in there with the language, with the word choice, and I would kind of let that come out. And people would read these things and think, this is your truth. This is something that happened to you. And a lot of times it really wasn't. It was literally just a construction of language. And this is how language can evoke things. And there's a truth in that as well. I don't think that the emotional response you have to something that's fiction is not real, is not a true response. It is, it's there. But yeah, it's so interesting when people find out that I'm like literally cutting up like poems from Poetry Magazine or from the New Yorker. I always go after the people that don't publish me. So just know that, future publishers out there. But anyway, because then I can take something back, reclaim it, and make it mine. That was once theirs. And it's kind of a weird kind of mutation process. And I like playing around with that stuff. But one of the projects that I was working on was this thing that eventually became Cryptopedia, which just got published last year from Nomadic Press, and Nomadic Press is a fantastic Oakland press. Buy all of their stuff. They're fantastic. Every single author that they have is amazing. And, I'm sort of the odd one who isn't amazing, but everyone else is. Everyone is super amazing. But anyway, I decided I wanted to go after Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is just this bane of our existence as reference librarians, because anybody can add to it and anybody can change it, and nobody's really checking it. And the people that they have that are editors, quote unquote, to be an editor on Wikipedia, you don't really need to have any experience with writing or knowledge of the subject. Basically anybody can do it. You just get approved and you become an editor, which I think is so weird, because usually we want things that are vetted. We want things which are written from people who actually know the subject. So anyway, so I decided I wanted to go after Wikipedia. So I started pulling out all of the articles that they had written about paranormal things, anything of any high strangeness I could find, because again, high strangeness is queer. There's queerness in that. And so I started pulling these things out and cutting them up and making them into poems, and that became Cryptopedia. And it ended up becoming sort of like this urban mythology, this sort of like book of these stories that are urban myths. They're things that that we tell each other online and in various ways. And anyway, so this is one that I particularly like, because it's about something that used to happen to me all the time. This one is called the 1111 Prompt. There it is. This is probably the only book that has a sloth on the cover, a prehistoric sloth that is not actually about prehistoric sloths. So I have that distinction too. But this 1111 is about these things they call midwayers, which are supposedly sort of like bodhisattvas, I guess, in the Buddhist tradition, but sort of like angels or something who are between life and death. And anyway, they communicate to us through digital screens. And anyway, I just found this such an interesting thing. And this is my cut up of it. And it's called the 1111 Prompt. And so it says, a Pavlovian bell rang where there was no bell. 1,111 spirit guardians called midwayers. I've witnessed streetlights blinking out while I drove underneath. My ability for pattern recognition, the innate 1111 prompt, visible signal broadcast through digital watches, a psychic wake-up call on mobile phones. In open spaces, I am prompted. I can't move the dark lentils of memory, hot circuits in any source of numbers. These unearthly comrades, transcendent, speak to us in that 11th hour. In the rusted bunker, amazing, I glimpsed 1111 prompts. The air comes full of char and dust, the river of time sweeping away a city burnt to crumbs. And so this one kind of has this story that evolves. So I don't know why I'm in a bunker or why this character's in a bunker, but they are. And they're sort of communicating with their angels through watches and screens and microwaves. And I just think it's really fascinating that people, we sort of make shamanistic things out of our digital. We make things we're always giving things meaning. We're meaning makers. And somebody told me that when it's 11:11, you're supposed to make a wish. That's the wishing time, which I think is fascinating too. But I love us humans as myth makers and meaning makers, and how we're always trying to make sense out of things which don't make any sense. And that's one of the ones that's in it. But maybe I'll read something that's more from Night Chant, which is more of a sort of traditional poetry. This is sort of my take. There it is. This is sort of my take on the kind of confessional poetry that was sort of popular at the time. And most of these are things that I wrote about that literally are not about me. They're not my story at all. But they still have this sort of, I don't know, sort of sweetness, niceness to them. This kind of like, I don't know, this emotion that transcends the fact that they're not really real or true, that there's this thing that the language evokes. Well, let me just read, well, this is the first one in the book. It's called Oedipus, and I'm fascinated by mythology. I love mythology so much, and this is my version of Oedipus. It says, "Night opens over the street like a wound. His mouth is wet. Spring crickets count off in the blackness. He whispers and gets in bed. A phone ringing somewhere is answered. The house groans and settles down on its back. His swollen feet poke out beneath the quilt. I read his rose scars like riddles. Tonight he'll enter me like a blind man, as if I were his mother and he could love her." And that's just playing around with all the, if you know the story of Oedipus, it's like the riddle of the Sphinx. So the riddle is in there, and Oedipus means swollen foot because they used to expose babies. That was their contraception. They would basically take them to a hillside and drive a nail into their feet and leave them on a hill. And that's how they would get rid of them. And of course, Oedipus comes back from that and slays his father and marries his mother. And, you know, if you've ever dated somebody who's a mama's boy, that's definitely one of those things. Oedipus is a big deal.
I don't want to reinforce negative tropes at all, and I don't think of this as trope. I think of this as a fact. But I lived in Italy for 2.5 years, and every single person that I dated lived with their mom. 100%. Oh, no. Well, this guy and I went on a date, but we never dated. We became friends instantly, even though it started out as an online date. But he didn't live with his mom. Every single other person that I dated lived with their mom, and I understood why. It was there were a lot of good things that were happening between sons and mothers. And you and I both love our moms, and we both talk about moms very much in our books. I wanted to circle back to something. Thank you for reading those poems. I really love them, and I think that it gives and this idea too of like how it is. I feel like sometimes I'm baffled by younger folks, and because I try to be patient and really, really listen and really focus on what it is that they're saying, and try to be slow to jump to a conclusion. But once in a while, it does seem to me like the message that I'm getting is that this isn't custom made for me. I'm uncomfortable, and so therefore I'm not doing it. And I think that if you're a young femme boy like I was, 100% of my life seemed like I was constantly trying to take the information that was coming in to my five senses and translate it into the imaginary world that I had to make up in my head, because I didn't have the internet. I used to go and change my voice and my CB radio name. And there might be people here that are young enough that they don't even know what a CB radio is. It's what truck drivers use or used to use in order to talk to one another. And somebody that I knew had a CB radio that I got my hands on, and I would use it and say, breaker 19, breaker 19, this is Hot Lips. Is anyone out there looking for company? Because it's fun and it's funny, and there's fun anecdotes that I can tell with my friends and stuff, and I use that, and I come back to this sometimes. But really, I was so lonely, that when I was doing that, I actually wasn't trying to be silly or make prank phone calls or something. I was desperately needing to connect. And because there was no way to connect, like pretending to be a sort of, and having read Natasha's book, I'm thinking about Eileen Mornis and just thank goodness that I didn't go to some of the places where I was asked to go, mostly truck stops, in my alter ego as Hot Lips. But it was constantly me taking like the cut up poetry, the assembled poem out of somebody else's work. That's what I was constantly doing. With mass media, with magazines, with the stuff that was coming through, the stories that I was being told in church. I was rearranging those words in order to try to make the world make sense. And I do think that it's my superpower. It was too bad that I wasn't able to see myself. And I remember like even reading your book was sort of like a gift to oh God, I cringe saying this, but I'm going to say it. But it was a gift to my inner child, because I actually, in what you said, like hit me really hard about our gay mentors like being wiped out. I was so incredibly lucky because women who oftentimes describe themselves as lesbian or queer or even gay, they use that word to describe themselves. Women like June Jordan, I think that she identified as bisexual and or lesbian, and Jewel Gomez, and Dorothy Allison. These were the people who I looked up to because the guys were gone. I did have Robert Gluck at San Francisco State, and Fenton Johnson was teaching there, and the poet Aaron Shuren was there. And of course, when I found James Baldwin, I think I read every single solitary thing that he ever wrote. And just as like, I think for 2 years, the single only author I read was James Baldwin, because he was talking about things that were relevant to what people that I knew were going through. Mm-hmm. And so thank God. And then also, my first mentor was Jan Mirikatani. And while she was married to a man, Janice Mirikatani, who recently passed away, while she was married to a man, she was Sensei. She was third generation Japanese American. And so much of the cultural pressures that she felt and the ways in which racism manifested was this pressure for her to be quiet and or submissive and whatever. She really talked about, and it's alive in her poetry, the ways in which she had to queer that space for herself. I don't know if that's how she would say it, but it's like create her own space, create her own community, because what was asserting itself as the dominant community didn't make room. Mm-hmm. And I think that for an artist, even though as a human being, a lot of us don't even survive that. And it reminds me a little bit of that famous passage in Sula that I was talking about earlier this morning with some of the people that are in this room, Celeste and Fernando, looking down the thing. But I couldn't find it then, and I can't find it now, although Sula is almost always close by me. That passage where it's just like, had she had an art form, had she had paints or clay or a notebook and a pen, and the luxury and the privilege of being able to be an artist, she may have been able to form her thoughts in a way that would have kept her from being self-destructive. So I think I was thinking about all of those things while I was listening to you talk and also read those poems, because in a way I do feel like I get to know you by listening to those, even though they're found pieces, because you're also selecting them. In the same way that when I go to a museum show for one single artist, I feel like I'm learning as much about the curator who's selecting and placing those pieces on the wall from if you go to a show from a prolific artist, oftentimes they have thousands of pieces, of which 100 are selected. Mm-hmm. And then there's the order that they're selected. And I feel like I'm learning as much about the curator as I am the artist in those situations. So thank you for reading those pieces.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to actually kind of go back to what we just started talking about when you were talking about how long this book, your novel, has been around. And I know that people are always really curious about sort of like inspirations, and it seemed like just looking through the back of the book at all the people you thanked, it seemed like, wow, this has a story. I mean, it probably has its own book to be written about it, and the experiences that you had, like with publishing and with agents, and it's, to me, it's always really interesting. I've had good and bad experiences. I had an agent for 3 years and she wasn't able to place anything, but she loved my work and she was, she was great. I really enjoyed talking with her, but I was so naive. I just really didn't understand how big publishing worked. And, I thought, well, if you write a good book, it'll get published. And that's like not always the case. And, her name was Carolyn French, and she would say things like, well, do you think Twilight got published because it was so well written? And I was like, no, it's dreadful. It just hit a target market, and that's all they were looking for. But, I had experiences where I would submit a manuscript to an agent and the agent would send it back to me and say, oh, it's a great story, but you've got the formula all wrong. And I would say like, well, what do you mean? And then they would go on and, well, you have two guys in here and it really should just be a guy and a girl. And then it'll be perfect, like YA fiction, and it'll just go right through the machine. And it's like, that's exactly why I'm writing this, because of the machine. I don't want it to go right through the machine. These are stories too. We exist.
That's terrifying, in my opinion. I keep using that word. I'm going to try to come up with a synonym. That is mortifying.
It is mortifying. It's sickening.
It's the opposite of being an artist.
Yeah, but it was curious. I was interested when you were saying that. I think it was the publisher who was saying make Thomas queerer and make him angrier? I love that.
I didn't know that I was waiting my whole life for that. I mean, I had gone to grad school with some excellent teachers. I had an unbelievable cohort people. I have wonderful readers. And I do think that at a certain point, when you go for something publicly, one of the things about my life that makes me a little bit different is that I felt that I was a success prior to having material success and or the kind of accomplishment. Why? Because I lived past 30. Nobody runs away from home in 1985 as a femme gay boy, comes to San Francisco, lands in the middle of the pandemic, watches their two best friends die slowly of a disease, and then watch 15 people after that die over the next 5 years. And then, I won't go into the history that's relevant mostly for my therapist, but nobody that has my story is going to complain. I've met Oprah Winfrey twice. I mean, I don't even know why. My life is so weird. I at one point I was texting on a regular basis with Nora Jones. Who knows why my life is the way that it is? But I've had a very interesting one, and I am alive. And you and I know what that means. And I think that the fact that I come from working class background, my dad was in the Navy. He never got to go to college. My mom did get to go to nursing school and then eventually got to go to school and grad school after she divorced my father and was, her kids were out of the house. But, I was never given a single message from anyone other than Jan Mirakatani, who ordered me to go to San Francisco State. And when Jan was your mentor and she ordered you to do something, you just like sort of stared in her face and then you did it. The next day you did it. My fiction sample for the MFA program at San Francisco State and the other places that I applied to 6 and got into 3. Her letter of recommendation for me was almost as long as my fiction sample because she also knew she was dealing with people that on a regular basis were dealing with 20 times the difficulties that I was dealing with. But she and I also had things in common in our stories about some of the things that had happened to us during our childhoods. And so I felt like I was a success, but I longed for a novel. And even today when I ended up having to take my motorcycle, battery ran out, and I ended up having to take a lift to San Francisco State. And then I took Muni back, and I hadn't been on Muni in years between San Francisco State on the MCAR and Castro. And I almost burst into tears because that unlikelihood that I was on that campus in an educational environment studying creative writing, given what my life was like at the very time. And then the longing that I had to be at the table and to be a part of a conversation, like listening to these writers who are guests in class. And then today I was a guest in the class. And I made it to 51 and I have somebody that loves me. It was just like, I thought I was a success. Then I published a novel and the relief from the community around me. they were like, thank fucking God, you finally got a book. And I had completely accepted the fact that I may never have one. And I already felt like, wait a minute, nobody like me gets work into the places that I got, and a job at a university, etc. So anywho's, that's a very long-winded way of my saying that, yes, it was a long journey, and I got super homophobic rejections. We've already done a gay book this year.
Oh God, that's so awful. Yeah,
Yeah.
I experienced some of that stuff too. Like we already published Dennis Cooper. We don't need another gay poet turned novelist.
Right. Literally like written out. Like I have them still. You know,
Right?
if I were interested in revenge,
Yes.
then you know, there are people that are still living that I have the literal letters in most cases, because this was back in the day when we were chiseling into marble, because we didn't have paper or pens or the internet. But anyway, some of it was that, but I think that also just a lot of it was just timing. And I think that what I was writing about, what I was obsessed with, and the ways in which I loved Dennis Johnson, when like the guy that did Jesus' Son, and I learned from Hemingway, but I was Baroque. My drag mom said to me, Chuck said to me, you spin yourself around in front of the mirror before going out, and you see whatever catches your eye, and then you put 10 more on. And so like the level of detail, the level of flashback that I indulge in my fiction writing, the associative mind, which I think especially a lot of queer people, it's like you can't have had the past that I've had and walk through your present life without simultaneously be thinking and referencing so many memories, and then also constantly trying to imagine a future for yourself that might be free of so much fear and anxiety, maybe is how I would describe myself. And so to me, it's a very queer aesthetic to do those things, but it wasn't what was being championed all the time. People were able to do it. They were able to break through, and that's what gave me my hope. But I also needed to learn some really important lessons. Like if an agent doesn't call you back for 18 months, that doesn't mean that they're busy. It might mean that they're in rehab. And so, you know, you can terminate you can get a new one. And so there's like 3 and 5 year spans of time where nothing was happening with my manuscripts. But the good news was I just kept writing. I just kept writing.
That's
writing
great.
and writing and writing.
You know, I was going to say this sounds like a good time if you wanted to read the opening pages to Doubting Thomas. And I have to say, this was such a hook. That first sentence just like knocked me right off the pedestal that I was reading on, and it's a knockout.
All right. Well, can I tell you what used to be the first line for years and years and years? And I let an agent.
What was it?
The first line used to be, and it used to be the first chapter. It was chapter 1. He didn't do it.
Interesting.
Because I wanted there to be no mistake in the reader's mind that this was going to be a book about whether or not he had done this thing. This isn't, what was that play that turned into a movie about whether or not the priest molested the kid? It was a brilliant Doubt. Oh, Doubt. It shows my Doubting Thomas minus the Thomas and the Ting. Chapter 1, Wednesday, May 1st, 2013. A single word printed over the picture of Thomas and his 4th grade class asked, pedophile? There it hung in Times New Roman bold, staring up from the online edition of the newspaper. He remembered the day the photo had been taken, only a year ago, when one of the parents snapped the candid shot as he and the kids lined up for a field trip beneath the oaks on the school grounds, just as Portland's spring had started to give way to summer and geraniums began to dot the forest floor. His body buzzed with a foreign set of sensations as he sipped mint tea. Only one other time in college had he felt something similar, the first of his HIV test results. Fear? Yes. A tamped down terror that buzzed in his chest, prickled and dampened the skin of his forehead, his scalp. Just as the mint had started to calm his stomach, another wave hit him as Thomas stared again to the online photo on his phone. His student's eyes were covered with black bars, the kind he had seen 30 years ago on naked people in medical dictionaries when he and his older brother James were kids and would sneak away from the children's lit section and into the science room. At the what? At the library. Thomas clicked to contacts, then family, then James. Before the first ring, his brother picked up, and said hello. Up until now, he hadn't told any of his family because up until today, even with all of his lawyer's warnings, he didn't believe there'd be reason. There's an unfortunate work situation, was all Thomas managed, imagining a national newspaper picking up the local story and James seeing it first. If anyone contacts you, don't comment and don't mention anything to anyone else in the family, especially the girls. Just then, his lawyer, Jerome, pulled into Thomas's driveway and honked the horn. More later, Thomas said, cutting his brother off. He got up and grabbed his rain jacket from the back of the chair and made his way to the door.
I was so hooked to like, what is going to happen? And again, I love the way that you play against that expectation. And because it's sort of like your own internal homophobia check, it's kind of like, well, the thing that drives me nuts, like in French, pédé is slang for fag, and that's from pederast. It's child molester basically. And it's like, why the hell did we get hung with this? It's like, that's not. Anyway, it's just so crazy. And considering the fact that like 95% of child molesters are straight men, so it's like, how did it get thrown on us? It's terrible.
Well, there is a history to that, and if I try to go into it, this will become a very boring Zoom session, so I won't. But there actually it was kind of like the crack epidemic was a targeted racist way to make white middle-class Americans afraid of Black people, perpetuate racism, and then pass political agendas. Something similar happened with the satanic scare around gay people and this conflation of queer people being a threat to the family. The thing that's weird about it is that it's global, that there are cultures, there's especially Native cultures that have oftentimes revered their sort of between gender and or queer members. But, colonization is brutal, especially like, the church that I was raised in did a lot of damage in taking what, historians have found to be neutral to very positive reactions to people that might identify as queer, and used religion in order to kind of turn against the sort of the other. So it was systematic in our country, to make this conflation. And also, what you said is that 95% of the people are straight. Like most of these people they're sick, and they're what they're doing is actually a crime against the body of a person. And it's not about sex, it's about power and control. And also it's usually about something heinous that happened to the perpetrator. I did a lot of research about this. And I always say, every time I talk about this book, I always say that the child, Toby in the book, tells the truth. He says, Thomas touched my pants. That is the truth. And because most victims of sexual assault and abuse do not lie about it. And so it's very important to me that people know. I do have a couple of editors, and I did have a couple of editors with this novel who said that they just didn't think that they could market a novel that was about these particular thematic concerns in 2020 or 2019 or 2018 or whatever it was, because Trump was in office after I finished the novel, and it was perceived by some people as a sort of critique of liberalism and the limitations of liberalism. And while some people might say white, and I would agree if it was about proximity to power or money, really this community all shares a certain economic status that really kind of shelters them from so much of what the average person is going through. So anyway, I really wanted to make sure that it was clear in my novel that it was where this idea of Thomas touched my pants went into the imagination of parents, and not at all about victims lying. And I think that people were, even editors and agents were even afraid that even though I had done that very, very clearly, that might be misunderstood and that I might be victim blaming.
Well, again, it's like like I said, it's the litmus test. It's like people are just they just respond viscerally to that, and it's not about what's actually there. It's just this whole feeling based thing. And that's the thing that I thought was so curious, and that's why I said you should probably read my book Ghost Songs, because Ghost Songs deals with actual sexual battery in it. You know, really horrifying. And it is real, and it is the thing that, like, you know, I had a classmate who was having a situation that was actually even more horrifying than that, where she was actually her father was basically abusing her and taking her to motels and stuff like that. And that's kind of where that idea came from. Like, this was happening, you know, when I was, you know, 12 or 13, and I was having to like analyze this and make it make sense. And you know, I certainly wasn't ready for that kind of information. And, you know, and so I thought I have to make my character Todd like really puzzled by how his friend is reacting and the things she's doing and, you know, and behaving. And all the adults are all triggered, and they all know there's something happening, and they're like asking him, and he doesn't know how to respond, and he doesn't want to say. And, you know, and it's one of those things like, it's so tough because children don't have the vocabularies that we do. And this is something that we come across all the time when you're a children's librarian. I had a kid one time who was looking for utopia, and he wanted a map of utopia. And I was like, well, I think it's a Greek idea. I don't think there's actually a picture of it. And he says, no, I've seen it. It was in the World Book. It's in Africa. And I'm like, Ethiopia? And he's like, Ethiopia. Okay.
But I would love a map to utopia.
We got to it. But, you know, I mean, it's that kind of thing. You know, kids they're at a disadvantage in so many ways, just because they can't express, and they don't have the capacity to understand, to be able to express certain things. And, you know, and again, it's like people were, I think, really kind of surprised when they've read this book. And I've had a lot of, I mean, to me, like, the most flattering compliments I've gotten about this book is when people tell me that they cry. They read it and they cry. And it's weird because when I read it, I cry. So it's like, I guess that's in there.
Yeah.
But we cry at different things. And, you know, and one of the things too, and I was talking about this, was, you know, my publisher balked at me when I said that I wanted to put these like help numbers and help things, the National Stop Bullying hotline, you know, put the email address, put the phone number, have these things at the end of this book. And they just didn't understand why I would want to put that in there. And I was like, because this is real. This stuff happens. You know, this might be the only place that some young reader recognizes his or her life, sees something from their life, and you know, maybe it clarifies something for them, and maybe they want some information, and maybe they want to reach out and find and get help. And I just, to this day, I'm still just stupefied that they even challenged me about that. Like, why would I want to put, you know, AA National Service or like Adult Children of Alcoholics, you know, put these different help things in there. Anyway, but to me, it was just too, I mean, I don't know. As a kid, I mean, I lived in such a fantasy world anyway. And this is the other thing too. I wasn't sure whether I was going to talk about this or not, but the ghost in the book is actually based on real poltergeist experiences. Not exactly, not as intuitively this thing that my friend Nicole and I used to like talk to. But we used to do this stuff. And Leroy was actually the name of this spirit and so I wanted to keep that because that was my like touchstone in the thing. And take your leave that, you know, we were kids. I don't know what was happening. But it was just something that was very important to us as kids. We had this secret, this thing that we shared. And so I kind of started playing with that and expanding that, and like, well, what if the secret was something else? What if the secret that they shared? And also the thing that I always try to write about too is that I think that friendship is the ultimate relationship. I think that it is, some ways it's stronger than like romantic love. There's ways that like it can endure things that a romantic couple can't endure. And I'm just fascinated with that idea of like friendships. And so a lot of my books revolve around that idea of like falling out of friendship with somebody or coming back to it, or how it can weather situations. Because that's fascinating to me. I mean, it's great having a best friend.
It's the biggest gift. It is.
Yeah.
It's the biggest gift. Listen, I want to say a couple of things about some of the things that you said before I forget. And one is one of the ways in which I was emotionally moved in the book was also just by the fact that you did include those resources. Because as a young person, and I'm again not going to get into too much detail here that might make other people uncomfortable, because I do have resources and help in order to deal with the fact that as a young person, I was so lonely and so bullied, and so I literally, anywhere that I could get affection, I would get it. And I took it in some places that were very dark and very dangerous. And when I came across books where people had experienced the kinds of things that I experienced in my seeking some kind of connection, it helped me know that I wasn't alone, etc. And I actually did once. I was told something by somebody once that, I think it was maybe 15 years after I was told about a resource. I finally called that resource because I did at that point need some help. And to me, that's the perfect place to get it, because if someone is pressuring a person that has been dealing with the kind of thing that Jennifer deals with, that sort of seduction, and she's got problems at home, etc. The part of it that sort of relieves the loneliness and validates some sort of mirroring is so confusing and compelling that person may not be able to make the choice to get out of it then, but they may later. And so I'm so glad that you put that in. And I also too want to say that I'm working on a novel right now where it's narrated by I'm Teresa Svoboda, the writer, has just read it, and she gave me some major feedback. And it was called Letters to the Dead, but she's thinking that maybe it should be called Fag Hack. And because Janice in the book is like she's mourning her best friend who recently dies when the book opens, and the nurses that are treating her at this rehab where she wakes up in are like, who's this Everett guy that she keeps talking about? And she's just like having hallucinations, or maybe she's going to the other side. She's definitely seeing ghosts. So Andrew, you and I have 6,775 things in common. It's crazy. But the ghosts are literally being portrayed in the novel as if they're just right there. And
I love that. That's fantastic.
And I actually was sort of like yearning, because I found out later too that there's a name for it, that I'm usually heterosocial, meaning the deepest and most profound relationships that I've ever had have been with femme folks, and many of whom, identify as use she, her pronouns, and so I lived with two women in my life, and these were the relationships that I learned the most about myself and about other people. At one point, there wasn't a single person in authority in my life. My boss at work, my dentist, my doctor, my psychologist, my whole team, 100% of them were women. I was sexually attracted to men sometimes, some men occasionally, but I didn't know how to relate to them. And that's another thing that I gave Thomas. He's kind of like lost when it comes to but he's also horny. So he sort of throws himself into, and that was another thing with my editor that I think was really interesting. And I'm keeping an eye on the time, since we said that we would end it at 7:30, and I don't want to go in the 10-minute version of that. But the point back to what it is that you said about friendship, I think is really deep and really compelling. I also loved Sigrid Nunez's The Friend. And it's both about like a dog and also her dead friend. And it's the ways in which we have intimacy with animals. I love books that illuminate the power of our pets. The Temple of My Familiar by Alice Walker comes to my mind. And like there's so many relationships that aren't so-called romantic that are so deep. And, watching, go for a sitcom, like I'm not going to criticize Will and Grace. I mean, I think that it was groundbreaking, and it probably did give families who had maybe historically rejected their sort of traditionally queer kid a way in to see these people as, interacting and accepting each other. And who knows, that might have had profound effects. What Will and Grace were saying to each other, I'm not mean to my friends. I'm not, you know what I mean? Like, I don't even get like sort of campy gay bitchiness. I'm good at it for like 6 seconds and then I'm lost. And I just feel lonely in the middle of it all. I like it when it's clever, but RuPaul always says, I'm sassy, not nasty, or something like that. It's just like, it's not about like tearing somebody down. And so I loved in your book that Jennifer and Todd were the primary relationship, and that was really the relationship that we were rooting for. And when they were estranged from each other, it was painful as a reader. I was really longing for them to reunite.
And as the reader, so much about what's going on, and poor Todd is just lost. I mean, he just doesn't know, and he's he's so confused and so frustrated also because he's having to care for this parent, and it's funny. Anyway, but it's just something that I've always thought about, and I like unlikely, I was just thinking about, I love films so much, and there's this amazing, I forget if it's Brazilian or Argentinian, but this film called Central Station that is about this older woman and this younger boy, and she basically has to take him to find his family. And their relationship is fascinating. And it's basically at one point she's going to sell him off, and she tries to sell him off for to sell his organs. And then she feels guilty about it. She goes back and gets him. And she's a drunk. And it's just this, but the way that these two relate to one another and the things they discover about themselves and about each other, it's just so fascinating. And I love that. I love the way people find ways of relating and ways of like bridging those gaps, whether it's age or whatever it is, because friendship is this magic thing. It absolutely is. There's no other way that I can describe it. It's the only thing that I can actually say is actually magic is friendship. It absolutely is. There's no explaining it sometimes. It's just something that you feel and and it's the best thing in the world when it's good, when you're laughing with your best friend, when you have this thing that only you two understand. There's just nothing like it. I mean, it's different. I mean, I love my husband, and and he's somebody that I can't imagine being without, but it's different. It's just different. He's not my best friend in the sense of like a best friend. But it's just different. Romantic love is just a little different from just platonic love. And I still think that friendship is just the ultimate relationship, and I'm going to prove it in one of my books, and you're going to prove it. And we do have like a million things in common. It's so strange. It's like, first we just had Natasha in common, and now we have all these other things. So it's great. And I can't wait to read your other stuff, because I haven't really read any of your prose, and I'm interested too in like, when even though I write fiction, I like nonfiction. That's the stuff I always go to. I like true crime. I love, I love theoretical physics. I love all kinds of different things. I'm just curious, like why nonfiction, like for you, like what do you feel, is it like May Sarton talked about, like you want to know what happened, or you want to document something, or
I promise I can answer that question, but I saw Christy come on cam, and I was wondering.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to let people know that we are running low on time, but if anyone has any questions, please do put them in the Q&A. And also for the folks that are watching on Facebook Live, I am watching that chat too. So if you have a question and you're watching on Facebook Live, please fire away.
Cool. Let me just say something about what and one last thing about what you said about husbands. My husband met my best friend Emily, and they get along really, really well. But Emily saw me through those years that I described earlier, and 3 out of the 4 people in Emily's immediate family were diagnosed with pretty severe forms of cancer, and one person didn't make it, and I was right next to her during all of those, during a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of it. And Ansu said to me at one point, my husband Ansu was like, and he's German, and so he's like Manny in the book.
It's Manny.
Yeah, it's Manny. He's Manny. Thomas loses Manny, and I wrote that so I could hopefully not lose him. But I was going to say, he said, if you were in the boat and Emily and I fell out and we were both drowning, who would you reach for? And I said, Ansu. We both know it's Emily. Sorry, babe.
It's not
little Ansu bubbles. We're gonna surface to the top. It's just like she and I have been through so much, even though of course that's not true. It's a metaphor, people.
You can grab both.
Yes, hopefully, but we were both acknowledging the truth of the depth of the intimacy of friendship, and he has the same thing with his best friends in Germany.
Absolutely, and it's funny because I was watching a Twilight Zone, Kick the Can, and that's one of the things that the lead character talks about is the things that keep you young. The Twilight Zone is basically these older people in this retirement community finally get together and they're allowed to play Kick the Can, which is this game, and because of that, they become young again. And it's so interesting listening to them talking about these things which keep them young, quote unquote. And one of the things is friendship. Friendship is a magic thing, and it really is. And that's just something that it struck me when I saw it in that in the Twilight Zone. But yeah, it's something that I think is very true. And yeah, that's so fascinating. If the two of them fell out of the boat, that's so interesting.
Well, and also after her husband died, she reunited with and her husband was my friend too. I shouldn't say husband. But after he died, a good friend of hers who she had dated in college, and she were platonic friends already. I mean, and he was friends with her husband too, but when they reunited romantically, and we were all together at one point early on in their newly formed romantic relationship. And he was kind of impatient because he was just like, if you guys are going to speak in that language, you have to translate it. And we were like, what language? Because we have our own stupid way of talking that actually is something that when we use it, other people can't understand. And it was alienating. We didn't mean to do it, but
right.
That's what happened.
That's another thing that's fascinating too, is how we create our own languages with others. There's this sort of like an intrinsic kind of understanding that we have. It's like when my mother and I talk, we're both talking at the same time and we understand each other perfectly and everyone's looking at us like, what are they saying? It's like, we just communicate like that. That's just how it works. I don't know. It's interesting. I love that too. And, language creates reality. So it's like, this is your world. This is your world with this other person. And this is the language you speak. And I think that's so cool. I love stuff like that. You have, just talking to you now, it's like, you have so many novels you can write. It's just like, there's so much stuff there. You just want to mine all of that stuff.
Well, I can talk a little bit about that. I don't know, Christy, if you have a question or something. Okay. Then I'll try to say this, and we're wrapping at 7:30, right?
Yes, we're just going to stop talking and
okay.
go fall backwards.
Yes. Okay. Good. The thing about creative nonfiction or memoir versus fiction, and why am I writing about that? I do have an answer to it, and I'm going to see if I can weave it also into something that you were saying earlier about storytelling. Like the thing that happens with the parents in Thomas's community that make him into like a predator when he's not, it's a story that is invented and made up in order to try to give meaning and or to provide context. And I really do believe that the parents believe it. and that they really are trying to protect their kids. And it's really more about, it's not really about believing that he's a predator as much as doubt that he could be. And that's enough, I think, for most people to have their reptilian brains activated when they have children. It seems like human beings exist on two ends of the extremes. It's like they don't care what their kids are doing, or they're so protective of them. I don't know. I guess it just runs a pretty big gamut. And I think that this particular population sort of errs on the side of like helicopter parenting and really, really being overly involved in their kids' lives. But the stories that we told ourselves to survive, and the people that tell stories, I think are, they can affect us. These are the things that create societies, et cetera. So for me in the nonfiction, I think that because I did experience some trauma, so much of what surfaces for me is very about my past is very difficult, or it's extremely nostalgic in a kind of like, oh, remember the club, remember the Colossus, remember the stud. It's like it has this sort of nostalgic tint to it. And I don't think that either one of those are very interesting for memoir. What happened to me during COVID, during this pandemic, our second one in our lifetime, not being in the highest risk category this time, was that so many memories surfaced of the other one. And so many of them were tender. And sadly for me, I lived a long time thinking about just these isolated moments that were really quite painful when I thought about the past. My parents not stopping me when I left home, like at 15, and like all of these other sort of isolated things that happened had kind of gotten gelled in my mind as what my life had been prior to coming to California. And what I realized is that the story is much more complex than that. And so I'm writing Failure, the memoir project that I'm working on, with photographs. And I'm only interested in recovering the tenderness, because there was so much tenderness and so much vulnerability in all of those moments. The thing that I fear the most is even when I'm talking about how lonely I was as a child and the things that I would do as a result and whatever, there's this simultaneous sort of voice in my head that says, you're being self-pitying. I'm not sorry that I have that. I think it really does kind of come from my particular individual Catholic upbringing, and then other aspects that are unique maybe to my family and the demographic that they were in. But I'm not sorry that I have that impulse, even though it's a little bit mean. It's Matthew being mean to Matthew every once in a while, because it sort of saves me more than it gets me into trouble. Because I can go down a self-pity grease slide, you know what I mean, if I'm not careful. Yeah. So I like that impulse, and I'm really, really, really interested in recovering the tenderness from my family, from my brothers, growing up with them. My dad is, experiencing some challenges, and so I feel like the trauma got in the way of all of the rest of the stuff, and I'm interested in recovering the rest of the stuff.
I think that's great. I like that. That's a great, that's such a cathartic and useful thing. Like, so the treasure of that, that's so valuable. That's amazing. Yeah, that's really, I mean, yeah, it's interesting too, because so much of our past actually has no real value to it. We're the ones who assign like this was good, this was bad. And it's funny over the years how those things change. And suddenly it's like this thing that I thought was like the worst thing that ever happened to me is actually probably one of the best things that ever happened. Like me breaking up with my ex after a 17-year relationship. And it was the best thing that could have happened. Because then I met my husband, which was the man. Right. It's like so. And so much of it is perspective. It's like when you're in the middle of it, it's so hard to see. I mean, how do you get that kind of perspective to see what's happening to you? You can only do that with time. I mean, time, and distance, it's the only thing that allows you to see. And I think actually it'd be a tremendous weird curse to be able to see that stuff, when you're actually in it, like knowing what other people think of you. That'd be horrible. Oh, horrible.
Yeah. I'm not usually very I'm so fascinated by people that I'm not usually afraid of them, because usually my curiosity trumps my fear in a lot of ways. There are exceptions.
Oh yeah.
But the people that I really am afraid of are the people that don't seem to be able to distinguish what they think other people are thinking about them. With, do you know, like they don't seem to know, oh, this is coming, like they think that they know what
Right.
other people are thinking.
Right.
That scares me.
That is scary.
Well, what an absolute and incredible pleasure. There are lots of things that I wanted to say. The last little thing that I wanted to say, my last very, very 2 cents, is that, believe it or not, when I was in middle school, I was bused from the middle school to the high school because the band teacher in middle school thought that I was a flute prodigy.
Whoa.
I played the flute because I had a crush on my cousin Sally. And she played the flute, and I had no idea that it ended up being one of the hugest sources of bullying for me, that I stopped, I completely stopped playing altogether. I have my old flute.
I have my old flute.
And I want to take lessons, and at one point to reclaim that part of my past.
You should reclaim
But
that.
can you believe that we even have that in common too,
That's
Andrew?
crazy. Well, at some point we're going to be playing like Gluck duets or something. Like
Exactly.
I could totally see that, like on a corner somewhere.
If only we had known this in advance, we could have done a flute outro duet.
Absolutely.
Although I don't know if I could, but I would have loved to try.
That is so wild. It is such a small world. It really is. But that's fantastic. How interesting. I don't know. I always wanted to be the cheerleader for the well, I mean, I know you are too, but I want to be the cheerleader for the writers in the room and just say, don't listen to what people say about your writing. If you should be your favorite author. If you love what you're doing, just stick with it. You'll find an audience. There's somebody out there. There really is. Even I was so surprised, that people relate to what I do. And, and I get fan art, which is so random.
Wow.
Like people paint pictures of me, which is so weird. But it's creepy, but it's great. I think it's awesome. It's like that kind of stuff. You get letters from people. It's part of the dialogue, and I want to, these are my images, these are my stories, and I just want to share them and show them. And I'm so thrilled if some people relate to it and we have that commonality and we can make that thing. And that's sort of my gift of friendship. It's like, if you like my stuff, chances are you're probably going to like me, and we'll be buddies.
I'm a lifelong fan. This was such a great opportunity.
That is so strange. I'm just going to be puzzling that. Yeah, how weird. And we've connected now, and we have other things. We have so many other things too, which we're bonded for life now. It's like we're probably going to be writing books together.
Yeah. Gosh, writing can get so lonely. So that would be so amazing.
It is the loneliest profession.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much. Did you have a final thought, Andrew?
No, I was just gonna just ask if there's anything anybody wanted to ask.
I don't see any questions in the chat. So, but I just wanted to say for anyone who tuned in late that this will be on our, it will be recorded, and so you can come back to it later on our Facebook, and it will also soon, probably in a week or two, be on our YouTube channel for the Oakland Public Library. And I just want to say a big thank you to both Matthew and Andrew. It's been a really delightful and thoughtful conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks a million, Christy. Thanks for everything.
Thanks for everyone for joining us tonight.
Thanks everybody that came. And
yes.
And go support your public library.
Yes, and you all get spiritual extra credit for being here.
Yes. Thank you, Nando. Bye, everybody.
Have a good evening. It's done.